All right, well, let's open up to 1 Kings chapter 12. My goal today is to overview the rest of the book of 1 Kings, to go through 12 through the end of the book, chapter 22. And we looked last week at Solomon's life, and how, not last week, but weeks ago now. Weeks ago, we looked at Solomon's life and the end of Solomon's life and the end of Solomon's reign. Of course, Solomon started out so promising. Solomon was blessed with great wisdom and riches and honor. Solomon's crowning achievement is that he built the temple in Jerusalem. But as we saw the last time we were together, Solomon's wisdom turned into folly, and his honor and his wealth ended up getting the best of him, and we saw the decline in Solomon's life and ultimately leading to Solomon's death. And as it was prophesied before Solomon's death, after his death, the kingdom, because of Solomon's folly, the kingdom would be torn in two. The kingdom would be divided. Solomon's son would inherit a portion of the kingdom of Israel, because God was still going to be faithful to David and the covenant that God made with David, but yet the kingdom would be divided, and Solomon's adversaries would take over the other part of the kingdom. So as we enter into 1 Kings chapter 12 through the end of the book 22, we find that the kingdom will be divided, and we see the results of the divided kingdom throughout the rest of this book. But as we look here in 1 Kings 12 through 22, as we see on our paper, we'll be looking more on our paper than in the scriptures today, just because we have so much territory to cover. The section begins by narrating the division of Solomon's empire into two smaller kingdoms. So Israel, now up until this point in time, we've used the name Israel to mean all of Israel. But the confusion comes in, especially when you get into like reading the prophets. They use the term Israel to mean the northern kingdom. So we're not talking about all of Israel. We're talking about the division of the northern kingdom, Israel. So can be a little bit of confusion because you may read in the prophets, when we get there 25 years from now, we'll read the prophets. That was a joke, by the way. When we get to the prophets, they'll say Israel, and you may think it may mean all of Israel, but they're only talking to a portion of Israel, the northern portion called Israel. So what you have is, you'll go ahead and look on your second page at the map. The map here just shows the major division. Up here in the north in the orange, you have the northern kingdom of Israel. And then in the south, you have the southern kingdom in green called Judah. So another confusing thing is that prior to this, prior to 1 Kings 12, we don't refer to Israel as the Jews, because there's no such thing as Jews pre-division, because the term Jews come out specifically of those out of Judah. So out of the southern kingdom of Judah is where we refer to as Jews. So it's all Israel up until this point, but then you have the northern kingdom, Israel, who had their own kings, and then you had their own places of worship, and then you had the southern kingdom, Judah, with their own kings and their place of worship still being Jerusalem. And then you'll find eventually the northern kingdom will be carried off and scattered by the Assyrians, and the southern kingdom, Judah, will be overcome by the Babylonians and be carried off into Babylonian captivity for 70 years. Then the Jews, southern kingdom, will be allowed to return, but Israel, the northern kingdom, remains scattered even until Jesus' time. So when you come back and you have Samaritans didn't get along with Jews because Samaritans were of the northern tribes that were scattered, and they intermarried, and they became kind of a half-breed of Israelites and those of Samaria and the other regions there. So you have Israel scattered, that intermingled, and they didn't have a pure line, but Judah came back as a unique identity there. So things kind of get scrambled from here on out. We started good with David under one kingdom and Solomon under one kingdom, but then we have this division. Half of them carried off into captivity. Half of them came back and established their identity as Jews, where Judaism came from. And so things really get messed up, not ideal from this standpoint. However, when Jesus comes, interesting note, when you come to the book of Acts, you have Jews and Israelites from every nation under heaven that have come back to Jerusalem. And Peter uses a specific phrase. He says, "Let all the house of Israel know that Jesus is now Christ." So on the day of Pentecost, you have these Israelites and Jews from every nation under heaven that have now come to Jerusalem, and Peter addresses them as all the house of Israel. So on the day of Pentecost, when the gospel's first preached, you have a reunification of the northern and southern kingdoms that are now hearing the gospel and taking the gospel back to their lands where they had come from. So you have in Jesus this reunification of all the house of Israel that hear the gospel for the first time. So lots of history there between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So it's good to know what's going on, and that will help you to read the scripture. That'll help you to know what's going on in Jesus' day. Jesus would say things like, I don't know why I'm getting all into this. It's just always come off the top of my head. Jesus would say things like, "I'm only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." That's a phrase that we may read in generality, but the lost sheep of the house of Israel would be those that had been scattered. So that's why you see Jesus going to Samaria, to the Samaritan woman. Why? What is Jesus doing? He's regathering the whole nation of Israel under him. That's why you see Jesus go into all these different places and traveling all around, going to the lost sheep, those who had been scattered, not just in Jerusalem, but those who had been scattered. That's why he tells them to go from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria and to the end of the earth. So you find this preaching of the gospel and Jesus' ministry specifically dealing with the Jews. Jesus' ministry was primarily to the Jewish people and to the Israelite people. His ministry, earthly ministry, wasn't to Gentiles. His death was for everybody, but his ministry is specific. And when you read the book of Acts, you find the gospel beginning in Jerusalem, and you see it going to the Jew first. And so this whole narrative of Israel and Judah being regathered together under the Messiah begins in the Gospels and continues through the book of Acts as well until all of Israel is hearing the gospel of Jesus Christ, their one true king on the line of David, who comes to establish his spiritual kingdom forever. So what we're reading here in 1 Kings has a lot of implications for the future, and even when we talk about the messianic promises through Jesus. So back to our first page on the paper, chapter 12 through 14. This is the first section we'll look at. Chapters 12 through 14 basically deals with Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Rehoboam and Jeroboam. The early divided kingdom is a story of conflict between Jeroboam, who becomes king in the north, and Rehoboam, who is king in the south. Now, Rehoboam is Solomon's son, who we see in chapter 12 goes to Shechem for all of Israel to make him king. So Rehoboam is set to become king over all of Israel, but there's been a prophecy that the kingdom would be divided. and that Jeroboam would be anointed king as well. And that's what we find happening here. So we saw the prophetic word. Now this is how it happens in chapter 12. And it's interesting here, if you like studying the Old Testament and you like seeing Jesus in it, you may want to write down this website. It's called Spoken Gospel. I've recently came across it several months ago. It is fantastic. It has short videos, and then it has daily devotionals, and it goes through all of these. And it pointed this out that, honestly, a lot of commentaries I was reading didn't point out. But what happens between Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and I have it down here on the paper, and this paragraph comes out of the idea of what happened with spoken gospel, is played out in a reverse Exodus story. Now, what happens in Exodus? In Exodus, Israel, the Israelite people, the children of Israel, are enslaved to Pharaoh, who makes them do hard labor. And God raises up Moses to come and free the people from the hard labor of Pharaoh. And what happens here is very interesting, because what we have in Jeroboam and Rehoboam is almost a reverse Exodus story. So what you have is Jeroboam, who had fled from Solomon. Jeroboam was living in Egypt. And he returns from Egypt in order to basically save God's people from the hard labor that Rehoboam was going to put on them. So Rehoboam, Solomon's son, is really in essence playing the part of Pharaoh, because they come to Rehoboam and they say, "We'll make you king, but Solomon put us to hard labor. How are you going to treat us?" And so Rehoboam goes to the elders and he says, "How should I respond?" And they said, "Lighten the people's load if you want to be welcomed as their king." Then Rehoboam goes to his younger friends, who are now his advisors, and says, "What do you think I should do?" He says, "Tell them you ain't seen nothing yet. If you thought Solomon was a heavy-handed leader, wait till you see me. I'm going to put harder burdens upon you than my father ever did." And Rehoboam listens to his friends instead of the elders. So he responds by saying, "I'll increase the workload. I'll make those I'm supposed to be ruling over slaves, basically, to me." So Jeroboam returns from Egypt to save God's people who were enslaved under Solomon's rule, who are now looking for relief from Rehoboam. But like Pharaoh, Rehoboam responds by increasing their workload. Like Moses, Jeroboam leads 10 of Israel's tribes out of this slavery into the wilderness of the north of Jerusalem. But as soon as they're free, Jeroboam builds new golden calves, like what we see happens with Aaron, Moses' brother. He built the golden calf right after the giving of the law, or during the giving of the law. Jeroboam now builds 2 golden calves and tells Israel, "Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." Israel's history has repeated itself, except Israel is the oppressor of their own people, and the man from Egypt is seen as the liberator, even though he fails as well. So it's a story again of failure and calamity and division. So there's a lot of political intrigue, there's a lot of treachery involved in this story of Rehoboam and Jeroboam. 2 prophets here, beginning in chapter 13, are described, sent from God to renounce Jeroboam's religious apostasy. So you have Rehoboam, who's treating the people hard. He does evil in the sight of God. Then you have Jeroboam, who seems to want to free God's people, but he ends up in idolatry. So the first, an unnamed prophet of God from Judah, is sent to condemn Jeroboam. That's at the beginning of chapter 13. The king's new religious practices in the north were nothing short of rejection of Yahweh's word. The second prophetic announcement was made by a prophet named Ahijah. He announced that Jeroboam has done more evil than all those who preceded him, and he has rejected God himself. Ahijah predicted that Jeroboam's dynasty would be short-lived, among many other horrible consequences of the king's sin. So Jeroboam is condemned by the prophets of God as well, primarily for his false worship and setting up of false idols and false gods. So we find the story of Jeroboam and Rehoboam happening in chapters 12, 13, and 14. Then beginning in chapter 14, verse number 21, going through chapter 16, as we have a list of kings, a summary of kings of Judah, the southern kingdom, and kings of Israel, the northern kingdom. And there's about 60 years of history that is summarized in about 3 chapters, 2.5 chapters here. So we're looking at chapters 14 through 16, the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. And so the author very quickly summarizes the histories of the individual reigns of the kings of Israel and Judah. Again, this is about 60 years of history, summarized in about 3 chapters. Here are the kings that you will find listed. First of all, you'll see 3 kings of Judah. At the end of chapter 14, you see Rehoboam and his story. In chapter 15, you have Abijah and his story, which takes all of 8 verses. Then you have Asa, king of Judah, and his section takes up a little more. Out of these, we're told, and if you notice, let's look just for a second. Look back in chapter 14, verse 21. With each of these, you'll see a pattern. Chapter 14, verse 21 of 1 Kings. First Kings 14:21. Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, was king in Judah. He was 41 years old when he became king and reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city of the Lord had chosen of all the tribes of Israel to put his name. Verse 22, Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord. And then it goes on to tell about a little bit about his reign. That's a pattern that you see followed. All right, if you look with me down in chapter 15, verse 1. In the 18th year of the reign of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, Abijah became king of Judah. He reigned in Jerusalem 3 years. And it tells his mother's name. In verse 3, he committed all the sins his father had done before him. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his forefather had been. Then if you go down to verse number 9 of chapter 15. In the 20th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, Asa became king of Judah. And he reigned in Jerusalem 41 years. Tells his grandmother's name. Verse 11, Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as his father David had done. So you see this pattern repeated in these chapters with each of these kings. You know, we'll tell who they were, how long they reigned, and whether they did evil or they did right. Most of them did evil in the sight of the Lord. So there you have 3 kings of Judah, the southern kingdom, Rehoboam, Abijah, and Asa. And then the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, or Nadab, Baasha, Elah, Zimri, Omri, and King Ahab is what you find in chapters 15 and 16. An evaluation of Rehoboam's reign, the author's concern is that Judah's sins have become more widespread than that of Solomon. The consistent theme of this unit is the enmity and war between Israel and Judah. So not only is the kingdom divided, but they are at war with each other. Abijah of Judah and Jeroboam of Israel continued in warfare, as did Asa, king of Judah, and Baasha, king of Israel. They continued in warfare as well. Again, in the accounts is noted who did evil and those who did right in the eyes of the Lord. You find Omri here. He is a king of Israel. And Omri extended the kingdom of Israel. In fact, Omri is alluded to outside of biblical sources, in secular sources as well. However, the biblical writer is concerned with what is happening not politically, but religiously with Omri's reign here as well. And of course, Omri's son is Ahab. And we are well familiar with Ahab becoming king of Israel. All right, as we open up in chapter 17, on the back of page 1, we find out of nowhere, Elijah the prophet comes on the scene. Elijah the prophet comes on the scene. And now we have the introduction of the prophetic office and Elijah the prophet. Of course, Elijah is a major prophet that we find here. He plays a major role, as well as Elisha. We're familiar with that. We'll talk about Elisha next week. But out of the great ideological struggle of politics, the office of prophecy begins to emerge based on the ministries of Elijah and Elisha. Now, there's always been prophets. We saw prophets with David and Nathan. But we see the prophetic office taken to a different level here. You know, these prophets are working miracles. They're doing signs. Very interesting stuff that happens with Elijah and Elisha. Elijah establishes a school of the prophets. And so we see a lot of prophetic activity here, which these Elijah and Elisha, along with Samuel, Nathan, the prophetic up until this point is what we would call oral prophets or spoken prophets. Later on, when we look at the prophets in Jeremiah and Isaiah, those are the writing prophets because they are written out. These are oral prophets that are spoken. Elijah and Elisha, prophets became God's instruments of warning to the king and the nation. Doom was imminent because of their sin. The author includes narratives on Elijah's ministry, 17, 19, 21, and then over in 2 Kings, interwoven with the account of Ahab's wars with Damascus. So in the midst of the history, we have this religious stuff, the prophets that's weaved in here as well. Elijah appears on the scene in 17:1 with no introduction. 17:1 says, "Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab." So there's Elijah on the scene now. He reminds Ahab that it's Yahweh, not Baal or Baal, is God of Israel. So basically what you're going to have here is the confrontation between Yahweh and Baal. Now, if you remember back, the world of the ancient Near East, every nation about had a god. There was a pantheon of gods that was believed to be. Yahweh was the God of the Israelites. There were gods of Canaan. There were gods of Samaritans. There were just gods. Everybody had a god. When you go to war, your God told you to go to war. Whoever's God was stronger, that's who won. That's how the ancients explained everything away. So Israel's God became Yahweh, and we saw back in Exodus where Yahweh, in overcoming Egypt, was at war with the gods of Egypt, for they had many gods in Egypt. So the ancient Near East believed in many gods. Israelites believed there were many gods, whereas today, we wouldn't believe there were many gods. There's only one God. We call that monotheism. Well, in the ancient days, they believed there were many gods, but like Israel believed only one God was worthy of their worship. That's called monolatry. One God was only worthy of worship, even though they recognized other gods. So this is seen here. Now when you come to this point in history, we've seen Moloch and we've seen many other gods, but Baal or Baal is the chief god here that we find that had Canaanite influence. And we see this contest between Yahweh and Baal. So with Elijah's first announcement that dew and rain would cease, it was a direct challenge to Baal, the Canaanite god of storm and rain. Baal was the storm god. A challenge issued by Yahweh, the God of the desert. At the end of a drought lasting 3 years and 6 months, Elijah issued a challenge to hundreds of the prophets of Baal and the nation. They would all meet at Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel was believed to be sacred to Baal, where the pagan prophets used their magical arts to entice Baal to rain down fire from heaven, all to no avail. We're probably very familiar with that scene. They're crying out to Baal, they're calling out to Baal, they're cutting themselves, and Elijah's really just sitting back mocking them because their God is not hearing them. He's not answering them. So he's taking pleasure in mocking these prophets of Baal. Then Elijah prayed a simple prayer, and the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the sacrifice, drenched with water that he had prepared. And thus Yahweh is the victor in this situation. The Lord won a great battle through Elijah that day, but the war was far from over. Enter Queen Jezebel, who threatened Elijah's life. Now, Elijah, who just finished, I wish we could spend time in all these stories themselves because they're so fascinating, but Elijah, who just won a great victory over all these false prophets, is now running for his life from Jezebel, and he enters a depression, and he's fearful and scared. Elijah was not prepared physically or emotionally to continue this conflict with Jezebel, so he runs. It's easier to run away and to ask God to use some other servant to continue the battle against Baal. But God gave Elijah what he needed, rest and food and a fresh vision, God coming to him in a still small voice. It's tailored especially for Elijah's stresses, came to him and refreshed him. After his retreat alone with God, Elijah was ready to return in battle and anoint his successor, Elisha. So we see the prophetic office of Elijah come to the forefront in these chapters, 17 through 19. Then when we enter chapter 20 through 22, these are the final chapters of 1 Kings, and it deals with Ahab primarily in his final battles. And in the midst of these, we find a very heinous sin that happens on the part of Ahab and Jezebel. There are two battles here between Ahab and a man named Ben-Hadad II, who is the king of Damascus, one of Israel's neighbors. Provided Ahab with a final opportunity to heed the words of Yahweh through the prophet. Although there was a measure of success, Ahab failed to embrace the prophetic word of the Lord. These episodes prepare for Ahab's death, recorded in the final chapter of the book. The famous episode of Naboth's vineyard. So in chapter 21, we find this story of Naboth, who owns a vineyard, that his fate meets a horrible fate in which Ahab would suffer for. Illustrates the extent of Ahab's sin and seals his fate. Naboth's property was adjacent to the royal palace in Samaria. The king wanted to annex Naboth's vineyard to the royal holdings, but ancient Israelite law prohibited the sale of one's inheritance. The idea seemed appalling to Naboth. Ahab had enough respect for the law to know he was unable to reverse Naboth's decision. And then Jezebel enters the scene, and she takes matters into her own hands through treachery, deceit, and eventually the murder of Naboth. She acquired the vineyard for Ahab. Once again, the prophet Elijah was there to announce judgment. Ahab had sold himself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord. So God sends Elijah to prophesy the end of Ahab's dynasty. Ahab will die in the same vineyard he stole, and the dogs he let lick up Naboth's blood will in turn drink his blood. For a moment, Ahab humbles himself before God, but it only just delays the judgment against his family. Then chapter 22, the final chapter of 1 Kings, relates Ahab's final battle with Damascus, a battle in which Ahab loses his life. In preparation for battle, Ahab and Jehoshaphat, who's king over Judah, consults what they called professional prophets, prophets for hire. These are prophets who just wanted favor from the king, so they would prophesy and tell the king anything he wanted to hear. So they consult professional prophets to discern the outcome of the victory. The point of the narrative is the contrast between professional prophets and true prophets, Yahweh's true prophets. So there's a true prophet named Micaiah, and for Ahab, prophecy was a form of magic in which the prophet manipulated God. The professional prophets merely repeated the king's desires in the form of a prophecy in an attempt to ensure a desired outcome. But for Jehoshaphat, the prophet was a mouthpiece for God. The word of the prophet made the will of God known to humans regardless of the king's desire. Ahab's death vindicated Micaiah, the true prophet of the Lord, and proved the professional prophets wrong. So Ahab goes into battle in disguise, but it doesn't stop God's justice. A stray arrow fatally pierces his armor. He bleeds out back home by his stolen vineyard, and the dogs lick up his blood. So what we see is we see in 14 through 16, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Then in 16, in those chapters we saw the other kings of the north and the south, and then the story of Elijah intermixed with Ahab, leading up to Ahab's tragic death. So nothing is going right in Israel or Judah at this time. Their fates already seem sealed. And just as a reminder, as we mentioned last time we were together, 1st and 2nd Kings is really written to answer the question, why did this judgment happen to us? What happened that got us in so much trouble, that made Yahweh so mad with us? And all these stories are answering the questions. Beginning with Solomon's pride, beginning with idolatry, beginning with war, bloodshed, not heeding Yahweh's law. It just descends into despair. Just about what we saw in the book of Judges. The condition of the nation just descended and degenerated into despair. And the same thing happens here. So all of this is answering the question in 1st and 2nd Kings, how do we get into this? How did the northern kingdom get scattered? How did Judah get overthrown by the Babylonians? And this is answering all the questions. So it's not so much, again, concerned with every detail of history, but it's concerned with theology of how they forsook the Lord, how they gave over to other gods, how they acted in violence and their own self-interests. And so that's how they got into this. So, the moral of all of these stories is the forsaking of Yahweh, the forsaking of truth, and chasing after everything that Yahweh says do not chase after. So that's what we find here. So we end 1 Kings on this note of Ahab's death. Then we'll pick up and introduce 2 Kings, and next week look at the ministry of Elisha as well.